بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. We have gathered today on the 10th of Jumad al-Akhir 1445 to talk about a great Imam of the past, who is the Palestinian scholar Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi. May Allah have mercy upon him. And we are joined again today by our teacher Shaykh Abu Ja'far Al-Hanbali. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ya Shaykh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I welcome you back. And before we talk about the early life and the upbringing of the noble Sheikh, could you perhaps begin by telling us a little about the history of Palestine? Because the Sheikh being from this land and many great scholars coming from this land, if you could tell us a little bit about background of this country and the origin of these scholars and how Islam basically came there.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa. Wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'dah wa ba'd. So in discussing Palestine and its early history for the Muslims, Palestine, before the Muslims came to it, had Judaism, Christianity, and some other religions that had been previous, which include the worship of the sun god and things such as this. The Muslims arrived there during the Khilafah of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. For the Kafir calendar, this is around AD 641 or 639. It depends because the Gregorian calendar had not resolved the errors in the Julian. So we're not really sure. But for the Khilafah of the Muslims, we know for sure they arrived around 1617 Hijri. When they arrived, Abdurrahman ibn Ghanam was among the first of the scholars that they produced. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he declared the area of Palestine a waqf, and he established it as such when he met the chief patriarch of Jerusalem. Chief Patriarch of Jerusalem writes in Greek as well as Aramaic and Arabic. And so do the Christians, some of whom were doing their mass in Aramaean. And so it's known who the Muslims were. They have different opinions on what they thought the Muslim Arabs were going to do, because there are already Arabs there, but the Arabs there are Christian. But conversion was slow. Conversion was slow. But it grew from Abdurrahman ibn Ghanam, who was one of the early Hadith scholars and is sort of the patron saint for bringing Islam to the Palestinians in terms of Hadith knowledge and other things. The Palestinians converted slowly because their background was heavy amounts of theology, especially with Palestinians coming out of the Hellenistic period, where they were deeply involved in Neoplatonist thought and rationalism. So Palestinians had to be convinced regarding Islam. Because they had to be convinced, they had to be convinced of the revelation. They had to be convinced of the truth of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they began to get deeply into critique regarding the seerah. So is it true what this man did? Is it true that he fulfilled these prophecies? Is it true? And because there were Jews and Christians that had converted to Islam from the Sahaba, that played an important role in explaining certain things to the Palestinians regarding the religion. After this, you start to have mass conversions of the people in Palestine to Islam. The most important of those mass conversions happens when the Imam Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi, who at the time was known as Ash-Shirazi, Abul Faraj, he arrives. And when he speaks to the Palestinian Justinian Christians, which were primarily monastic living people, very scholarly, he speaks to them and he answers their questions in a very detailed fashion. This leads to a huge mass conversion. This mass conversion happens in what at the time was known as Shechem, which is Nablus. So Nablus, which had been known in Hebrew as Shechem, undergoes a mass conversion. And the place that they undergo this mass conversion is at the old church.
Mm-hmm.
And this church is converted into what becomes Al-Jami' al-Salahi, which we know it today. And the place where he is laid to rest, Abul Faraj Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi, becomes the chief meshhed, or the chief shrine graveyard. Now, this Imam who dies 471, according to most of the accounts, rahimahullah, is one of the successors, one of the 40 Qadi successors of Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la al-Baghdadi, rahimahullah. So he comes there to resolve the theological issue. So we're already familiar with Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la because we've discussed him countless times, and he's been brought up on other occasions. But really, the patron saint after Abdul Rahman ibn Ghanam is Abul Faraj Abdul Wahid al-Shirazi, because he leads to these mass conversions in Shechem that becomes Nablus, and in particular that portion of Nablus, Kafr Qadum, that area. And it's so interesting because that area is said to be the place where Nabiyuna Ibrahim alayhi salam circumcised Nabiyuna Ismail alayhi salam. Kafr Qadum means the town of the bladed axe, because he had to use the bladed side of the axe to do the circumcision. That is that place. And Al-Jami' al-Salahi is located there. So there were some amazing things that happened that led to the Palestinians who had been converting to Islam, but rather slowly, start having these mass conversions. And they start happening in Nablus and the areas around. So most of the villages around Ramin, all these other areas, Jerusalem mass conversions start to become more of a factor. And as these mass conversions increase, it's almost like watching flowers bloom, because it happens in unincorporated Nablus and then all the villages around it. Then it gets closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem, and it starts coming into effect in Jerusalem and other areas around. And there's this profusion of theologians and fiqh scholars. But it started from the mass conversions, not conversions themselves. Those were happening, but they were a trickle. Mass conversions start at the point of the arrival of Abul Faraj Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi later, but he's known as Ash-Shirazi.
And this Sheikh, how close is he actually to the scholars and the Maqdisi family that we know of, like the Banu Qudama and the like? How close a relation in sense of family and or student-teacher relationship?
Abul Faraj Al-Maqdisi is technically, he's called Al-Maqdisi because he became resident there, but he's actually not related to them, because he wasn't Palestinian by background. He came from Baghdad and Iran, because he was based in Baghdad, but then he had been in Iran. And so he goes there to bring the religion. So I don't know whether he was Persian ethnically or whether he was an Arab. But his becoming Maqdisi, because it mentions after his name, Thumma al-Maqdisi, later known as al-Maqdisi, because he just became resident there. And then by being resident there, he just became amongst the people and part of the people. And one of the powerful things about what he did is, and I think this has to do with what led to the mass conversions, is he became part of the people. So he sat with them, he ate with them, he made himself available. He became resident there. He didn't just visit, but he became resident. He spoke to the people. So by doing so, by becoming resident, by living among the people, you become included among them. And even if you're ethnically different to them, they start looking at you as one of themselves. And they start seeing you as part of them. And to the point that where when he dies, his janazah is attended by Christians and Jews who come to give their condolences, because he's considered, although there's theological difference between them, and they know that he held them to be upon kufr. In his book Tafsirah, and because he wrote two big books. One was a Tafsirah, which is sort of a theological manual that takes you from A to Z, or A to Z. And then fiqh it includes also fiqh points within it. He did in that book a little bit like what Ibn Battah, who died 387, rahimahullah, kind of what he did in Al-Iban is like he included the theological issues, some minor theological issues that came up, and then also he included some fiqh issues where there's some things to just get the people started. He wrote another really big fiqh book where he tried to dampen down the flames that got the flames that were ignited when Ilm al-Kalam starts getting introduced to the Palestinians.
All right.
Because Ilm al-Kalam starts to get introduced because in the late 400s, early 500s, the complete Ash'ari Jama'ah, because by this time they've crystallized as a Jama'ah, they arrive in North Africa. And then they start making their way eastward to where they arrive in Sham, in particular, in Palestine. So he writes his book to try to dampen the flames of this discussion because there's these huge mass conversions. Why would you want to introduce like a lot of complex discussion? And they just come out of like that whole Hellenistic philosophical phase. So why would you want them to like go back into that when their hearts are at ease, the people are of one accord? Now you're bringing it back in. And so now, because the people start asking Abul Faraj questions, the people say that you are Mujassim. Is this true? The people say, and it's like, do you know what Mujassim is? And they're like, well, no, we don't. We just know that we're supposed to stay away from you. Some of these people have told us. And it's like, so now all of that work where he'd been teaching them for years, and there were because he brought 4 other big scholars with him at Shirazi, where all these problems start. But alhamdulillah, they ultimately wind up leaving off a lot of the philosophical arguments and a lot of those other things. And ultimately, those things fall by the wayside. Because the fitan was so great, this big book had to be written. It's called by different names. Some call it Qawl al-Sunni, some call it Kitab al-Sunni, it's many different names, but it's sort of answering those issues, but it's answering it in a way in which it's written where you can tell he's sort of talking to laity and answering their questions. And then once that was resolved, then the continued flowering of Islam among Palestinians happens. So they focus on their fiqh, they focus on their other things without getting bogged down. Because what you want is to be established on creed and to be established on fiqh. You don't want people zigzagging and having these other issues. That's not what you want.
And this sheikh, do we know his successors there in Palestine?
Shirazi, upon his death, Abul Faraj Abdul Wahid, Shirazi Al-Maqdisi, he leaves behind other scholars such as Abdul Khaliq Al-Ramini. And Abdul Khaliq Al-Ramini, now he is the fruit coming out of one of the villages of unincorporated Nablus from Ramin. And he winds up being the theological and fiqh father of the rest of the Ramin people, because the Ramin, who comes out of Ramin? Shamsuddin ibn Muflih al-Maqdisi. The whole Ibn Muflih, like all of them, they're all coming out of Ramin. So he becomes like their theological and spiritual ancestor, Abdul Khaliq al-Ramini. Yeah, so he's sort of one of his main successors. There's about 3 or 4 other successors besides, but he's sort of the standout one. And he becomes like this towering figure among the Palestinians.
SubhanAllah. And a lot of the scholars that we know of, like the Hanbali scholars who have the title Maqdisi, meaning so they're from Jerusalem, right? Which is from Beit al-Maqdis.
They're from Jerusalem or surrounding area.
Right. Okay.
So when you have Imam Muwaffaq al Qudama, and say, oh, Al-Maqdisi, he's not. Someone could say, oh, well, he's not born and raised in Jerusalem. Yes, but Jama'il and the surrounding Nablus is considered part of that area. It's considered part of Beit al-Maqdis. And in addition to that, the proper name of Palestine has been referenced as Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, the Holy Land. So people coming from either Nablus, the surrounding area, or sometimes that area altogether are called Al-Maqdisi.
Okay.
In general. But in specifics, when you meet people with that title, it's usually because they're from Jerusalem or the surrounding areas that are considered part of Jerusalem. But you'll find some ulama that are not from that surrounding area. Just the fact that they're from what's called al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, because they're from there, sometimes they're called Maqdisi as well.
So now that these scholars, Sheikh Shirazi and others, have established Islam there, there's the ilm being taught. Now we get closer to the age of the current Sheikh that we'll be talking about, who Sheikh Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi. Now, could you tell us more about when we get to that period and his parents and where Islam came to them and his upbringing and so forth?
To come to his era, we now want to talk about how knowledge spreads. So, in the era just preceding Abdul Ghani and Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi, the area just preceding his had been an era of a wide profusion of hadith books. And in the profusion of hadith books, you have the rise of Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Nasa'i. And so all of this work is being written. But the work is being studied, and as it's being studied, people are tending to keep it in-house. And because they're keeping a lot of the hadith in-house with respect to the narrators handing the books down, the ilm in the science of hadith doesn't flower as much as it could. And so what happens is Ibn al-Jawzi, who comes later on, he opens the doors to it where he starts saying things like Rawahu al-Bukhari, Rawahu Muslim, Rawahu Abu Dawud. Because before people would just say, yeah, this is narrated from my sheikhs to this. Because you have to remember, these people are coming from Ahmed. They're his students. Abu Dawud, Muslim, Bukhari. They're Ahmed's. They're from his school. So people aren't sharing out the knowledge. They're keeping it in house. But you don't get to share. And by them sharing it out, these hadith books now spread more widely. Now, what happens in that era is there starts to be a study on the narrators of these books, because there has to be a discussion around all of the narrators, and we need to have books that go to each of the narrators. They explain the narrators, their place in Islam, where they're from, and the relation of narrators to each other. So there's a discussion on how are we going to do that. And up until the time of Abdul Ghani and Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi, you had to go to several different books. The Sihah Sitta at this point aren't referred to as the Sihah Sitta yet, and terms like Muttafaqun alayh and things like this aren't used yet, because they're not canonized into one set where they're studied consistently. That comes from the era of Abdul Ghani Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi. At that point, you also have, in the era just before, the Crusades have been called. So Pope Urban, because of something that happened in Jerusalem, the ruler of Egypt at the time, Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah, was an Ismaili Shi'i. And as an Ismaili Shi'i, he starts to make declarations about who the true Imams are to be, because they're different to Ithna Ashri. The Ithna Ashri believe that there are 12 Imams, but the Ismailis believe that there's a continuance of Imams and that there is an Imam of the age in every era. So Al-Hakim Amrillah declares himself the Imam of the age. Then after this, at one point declares himself deity. Now, upon declaring himself deity, he then starts to outlaw things in Egypt. And while he's doing that, intrigues start, where people start to consider we might need to kill him because he's becoming so tyrannical. He's declared himself deity. We might have to kill him. And one of those who starts the plotting is Shajaratul Dur, his sister. Before this happens, before his death, he decides that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre must be demolished. And he tries to have the church destroyed. When news of that attempt reaches the European peninsula and surrounding areas, Pope Urban calls for a war of the cross to protect the Holy Land. And so crusaders are sent. And when crusaders are sent, they kill, when they first reach Antakya, which is Antioch, they reach there and they kill most of the Muslim inhabitants, which are more than 300,000.
Wow.
They killed them. And this is in the month of Sha'ban. They killed them. Then, before reaching, and this is something that a lot of Christians don't mention, before reaching Jerusalem, they stop in Constantinople and they damage the Hagia Sophia because these are Latin Rite Christians. And because they're Latin Rite Christians, they are different to the Byzantine Rite, which are Orthodox Christians, because there's an argument with respect to the filioque, which is the belief that the Son issues forth from the Father and the Holy Spirit. There's arguments about the nature of the Trinity and are they the same substance, exact substance. Arguments about papal supremacy, because the Orthodox Church do not believe that the Pope in Rome is supreme, that he's the second part of the Trinity on earth in the absence of the Son, that he's infallible, that he speaks ex cathedra, and so forth. So when they arrive at the Hagia Sophia, they damage the Hagia Sophia to such a degree that it's actually beyond use. And the Christians there have to start doing mass in other locations. And so by the time Muhammad al-Fatih the first arrives, Hagia Sophia is beyond use. So this idea that he sort of stormed in and just took over the church and converted, no. Hagia Sophia is in ruins. When he arrives, it's ruined. And so when he converts it to a masjid, it's after it had been a burnt out wreck. Well, the Crusaders, after their stop off for slaying, then get to Jerusalem. And the people barricade themselves in. They force their way inside, where they cut loose and kill a vast amount of people, also committing acts of savagery, not just rape, not just plundering, but cannibalism as well.
SubhanAllah.
After which time, the Muslims put up a valiant defense, but they wind up having to escape after they can no longer hold on. So the Dome of the Rock is converted into a church called Temple Seclorum. The Al-Aqsa, the masjid that's usually, because the whole compound that it sits on, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Masjid, that whole compound is called Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. But what's sometimes called the furthest masjid, sometimes it's called Masjid Salahuddin, it's called by other names. It sort of has a grayish green dome. That's sometimes also called Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, as shorthand. Now that masjid is turned into a horse stable. Well, this is, now at this point, we're coming to the eve of the birth of Abdul Ghani ibn Wahid Al-Maqdisi. So at this point, Ahmed ibn Qudama, who's the father of Muwaffaq-ud-Din, he's his father. He and his brothers, after a hard-fought jihad, have to do a tactical retreat. And they come to Damascus. But because these are primarily farmers and agriculturalists and pastoralists, they bring their cattle with them, which in this case are goat and sheep. So it causes some disruption in Sham, because the people in Sham are Arameans, majority Arameans. There are some Arabs, but even today, they're majority Arameans. And Arameans are not Arabs, although they speak a language close to it, but they're settled city people. So they're glad to accept the Palestinians that come as refugees, but they came with cattle. So where do we put the sheep? Where do we put the goats? They also have typhus, because other diseases that came through the difficult journey, they've acquired typhus as well as tuberculosis. And the Palestinians, especially the clan of Ibn Qudama, they don't want to be a burden. So they ask for permission to buy a plot of land. And they buy this huge plot of land, and it becomes the Salihiyya district. And that's where the Hanabila lay down their roots. And it's there that Abdul Ghani ibn Wahid Al-Maqdisi, that's where his life formally begins, because he's born in Jama'il, but he's not old enough to remember his life there. Right? So this is the era just before him.
SubhanAllah. So once he has been born there and they have migrated towards the outskirts of Damascus, right? So it's not inside Damascus, but it's really on the outskirts, right?
That's correct.
Then as a youth, where does he go? Where is he taken towards to study? Or does he study within the outskirts of Damascus in the beginning?
Okay, so in looking at his life, so we have his name. which is Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid, ibn Ali, ibn Surur, ibn Rafi, ibn Hasan, ibn Ja'far, al-Jama'ili al-Maqdisi. His kunya is Abu Muhammad, and his laqab is Taqi. He is related, like the Ibn Qudama clan, where they are direct descendants of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. He is born, according to some accounts, in the year 541, while Diyauddin al-Maqdisi, who died 643, rahimahullah, he's family to him. He says that when he asked his mother, because his mother is related to them as well, when he asked his mother, she said that he's 4 months older than Muwafiquddin and born in the same year. So Muwafiquddin al-Qudama is born in Sha'ban, whereas Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid, Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid is born in Rabi al-Akhir. So they're agreed that he's born in that date. And when he's born there, he comes from a family of knowledge. And he starts as a young boy in the year 550, or just a little bit after of the Hijri. He goes to Damascus. Now there he listens to Abu al-Mukarram ibn Hilal, Abu Ma'ali ibn Sabir, Abu Abdullah ibn Hamza ibn Abi Jumayl al-Qurshi, and others. After this time, though, in the year 561, he decides to go to Iraq. Because Iraq, this is an Iraq that's before the great catastrophe in 656 Hijri. This is before then. So Iraq is still in its heyday. So he leaves along in a caravan along with Muwafiquddin ibn Qudama, Abu Umar al-Maqdisi, Imaduddin al-Maqdisi, Bahauddin al-Maqdisi. Like, these are like the galaxy of scholars that are going to become huge. They leave in the year 561. And he becomes, what they decide is they create a system to assign people to each person so they don't get lost. And so Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi is assigned Muwafiquddin Qudama as his travel buddy. So they become travel friends. Now, they become established in Baghdad, and they stay there for 4 years. It is while they're there that Imam Muwafiquddin Qudama, he starts to incline heavily towards fiqh. But Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi starts to incline heavily towards hadith. Now, this is while they're both in the presence of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, rahimahullah, who they meet before he dies. And they review his knowledge with him for some 40 days. So he's teaching fiqh, he's teaching i'tiqad, he's teaching all these different things, he's teaching hadith. And Imam Muwafiquddin Qudama, he said that when they were established there, وحكى الشيخ الموفق أنهما أقاما عنده نحو من 40 يوما ثم مات, that they were both established with Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani for 40 days rehearsing his knowledge, then he died. وأنهما كانا يقرآن عليه كل يوم درسين من الفقه فيقرأ هو من الخرق من حفظ والحافظ من كتاب الهداية. So they had been rehearsing to him every day. They did 2 dars in fiqh. So they're doing 2 dars a day in fiqh, not 1, 2 dars a day in fiqh. And what they're doing is Muwafiquddin Qudama is reciting to him the Mukhtasar of al-Khiraqi from memory, and then having that checked and going over the Sharh. Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi is reciting the Hidayah from memory and having it checked. Now, the Hidayah, Allahu Akbar, the Hidayah is written by the Sheikh of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani,
Subhanallah,
who is Abu Khattab Mahfuz ibn Ahmad al-Kalwadani, who dies 510 Hijri, rahimahullah. So he's reciting to him this, and this must have been a powerful thing for Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani, because to hear the book of your Shaykh recited by memory from someone that you've never met, and they're reciting this book to him. So he recites him the Hidayah. Now, Diyauddin al-Maqdisi, he says in his history, because Imam Diyauddin al-Maqdisi, we remember that the ahwal of Abi Umar al-Maqdisi was written by Diyad al-Maqdisi.
نعم.
Well, Diyad al-Maqdisi has also written an Ahwal Abdul Ghani Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi.
سبحان
He's
الله.
written a life and times for him as well.
ما شاء الله.
So what we're reading from is that
Excellent.
from Tabaqat al-Hanabila by Ibn Rajab, who died 795 Hijri, and we're also reading from the Sir A'lam al-Nubala from Imam Muhammad Uthman al-Dhahabi, who died 748 Hijri. So that's what we're reading.
I just had a quick question. The men, both Sheikh Ibn Qudama and Abdul Ghani Al-Maqdisi, they're both now in their early 20s, right?
This is correct.
And when they're reading from memory these kutub of fiqh, it means that they're probably going for ifta.
This is correct. They're
Okay.
going for this because they're memorizing, they're working hard, they're striving. And notice that when they're there, they're reviewing it with them. That means that before they left, they'd already memorized it.
Right. Indeed.
So before you go to these people, you're already doing something. So that means they were being prepared before they got there. Abu Umar al-Maqdisi is there, right? Imad al-Din is there. Baha'uddin al-Maqdisi is there. Like all these people are there.
And was Sheikh Abu Umar, meaning the elder brother of Ibn Qudam, was he already before them there or with them?
No, he's actually, he acted in the place of their father. Right. So he's sort of their guardian while he's there. So he's in the classes with them, but he's also he's like the Amir of their travel journey because he's the elder brother. He's 10 years elder to Muwaffaq al-Qudam. So Diyad al-Maqdisi rahimahullah, he says, after that, they worked very hard and strived in fiqh and knowledge of the ikhtilaf in fiqh, and they sat with Ibn al-Manni. Now, Ibn al-Manni, rahimahullah, is Abu al-Futyan, and he is one of the most important figures after Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani. He was like the marja of his time. And so they're both learning from it. Now, this is a sort of an interesting point. They both sit with Ibn al-Manni, and then Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, who died 653, he sits with a student of Ibn al-Manni. And these two combine the knowledge of the madhab, and they wind up becoming the Shaykhan. Right. They wind up becoming the Shaykhan. So Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid and Muwaffaq ibn Qudama, they sit with Ibn al-Manni, and they go mas'ala by mas'ala every day, listening and disputing with one another in fiqh issues to get an understanding of it. And they also learned from Abu al-Fath ibn al-Batti, Ahmad al-Muqri al-Karhi, from Abu Bakr ibn al-Naqur, Hibatullah ibn al-Hasan al-Hilal al-Daqaq, Abu Zur'a, and others. And when they finished that, they head back to Damascus. Now, after they head back to Damascus, Al-Hafiz Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, he then heads out again in the year 566. Now he's headed to Egypt and Alexandria. And he stays there for a period of time to memorize a hadith. He then comes back. Then he has Alexandria again in the year 570. And he listens to Al-Hafiz al-Silafi and others. And he says of this time, he said that he wrote 1,000 pages from Al-Hafiz al-Silafi in hadith. In fiqh. He was in Egypt and he listened to Abu Muhammad ibn Badri al-Nahwi, the grammarian, and others. He then returned to Damascus. Then he sets off again in the year 570 of the Hijri, and he heads to Asbahan in Iran. And when he heads there, he's now sitting and learning knowledge. And he stays there, and he memorizes books of hadith. Then he comes back. Then he heads to Hamdan in Iraq, and he listens to Abdul Razak and Ismail al-Qarmani, and Al-Hafiz Abu al-Ala, and others. He also memorizes hadith from Abu Musa al-Madini and Abu Sa'ad al-Sa'igh and others in Isbahan. He goes to Mosul, and while in Mosul, listens to Abu al-Fadl al-Tusi and writes out his book by hand.
MashaAllah.
Then he heads back to Damascus. Then he narrates more hadith. Then he listens and sits with more people. And as he does this, his knowledge is increasing and increasing and increasing. And his level of ahadith and his hifz of ahadith starts to become legendary among people. Legendary. To the degree that Diyad al-Maqdisi says that based upon what was mentioned. The historians of the time called him Amir al-Mu'mineen fil Hadith.
Subhanallah.
Now, there's a very small number of people that have been called Amir al-Mu'mineen in Hadith. Right? Imam Ahmed was called Amir al-Mu'mineen in Hadith. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is called Amir al-Mu'mineen in Hadith. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali is called Amir al-Mu'mineen. Al-Hafiz Abdul Ghani Wahid Al-Maqdisi is called Amir al-Mu'mineen in Hadith. Right? So he belongs to this huge category. Now, the Tabaqat literature for Tabaqat al-Hufaz list him at topping out at 700,000. Right? So he has an immense level of hadith knowledge and his knowledge of narrators.
MashaAllah. And just as a quick understanding, he's an established scholar at this point, right? And he has a mastery, or he's extremely specialized in all of the ulum. But this particular specialization in hadith, is that a personal inclination of his then?
Yes, that started because if we go back and remember, he started inclining towards hadith when he was in Iraq.
Right. Okay.
Right. What happens is you can see they're both classmates. Muwafiquddin and Abdul Ghani and Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi, they're both classmates. But as they're in class, they start to incline towards different areas. So you see Muwafiquddin al-Qudama inclining towards fiqh. And you see Abdul Ghani inclining towards hadith. Right. So you start to see they're sort of pulling apart in those areas. You see, because you remember, they're also in a class where Ibn al-Jawzi is in that class. Because Ibn al-Jawzi, being the hadith scholar that he is at the time, because he dies 597 Hijra, rahimahullah, he's teaching them hadith. So when you look and say Kitab al-Tawabin by Muwafiquddin al-Qudama, the main rawi of hadith is Ibn al-Jawzi. That's his main rawi. And then sometimes in other kutub, Muwafiquddin will be quoting from Abdul Ghani Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi. Like sometimes he'll say Ibn Akhi or Ibn Am or son of my uncle or son of my brother. Like he'll use affectionate terms like this to be referencing Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi. He'll be referring to these things, right? Now, understand at the time when they're there, Imam Muwafiquddin al-Qudama there and in Damascus is preparing his fiqh curriculum. And as we know, his fiqh curriculum, he started writing out Al-Mughni in Iraq. And he's Marja at this time, 1718. But then he starts to create other kutub. One of them being Al-Umda. Now, Al-Umda is being made at the same time that Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi is writing Umdat al-Ahkam, the Sughra and the Kubra. Because the ahadith, if you study it, when you study it with someone, the ahadith in Al-Umda fil fiqh, they're the ahadith that are extracted from Umdat al-Ahkam, which means there's a borrowing that's happening between them because they're writing these books probably with each other.
Subhanallah.
They're probably sitting down writing, it's being compared where they're writing these books with each other. And then you have Al-Muqni' gets written, which doesn't have a dilla in it, just the reasonings. And then Al-Kafi, which when you compare Al-Kafi to the Umdat al-Ahkam, the Kubra, you can see that there's been borrowing between them, which would make sense because they're in the same class. And if you have a hafiz of hadith and someone who that's his specialty, so you can discuss jarh and ta'dil, that's excellent. Because now you know that the hadith that you're putting in, because he's an established muhaddith in his own regard, but to have someone that is what they do, that's their emphasis, that's their life, then that's even better. Because now you say, listen, I'm looking for this narrator. And they can tell you, yes, this narrator is sound, or this narrator is this, or that narrator is that. So you can tell that sometimes you can see the influence of Abdul Ghani on the Muwafiquddin al-Qudama. You can see like that influence is there.
And isn't there also like a third person there as well, who is Shaykh Bahauddin Al-Maqdisi, who's writing the
Yes. Yes. Now, Bahauddin Al-Maqdisi, you can tell who Bahauddin Al-Maqdisi does the sharh on the Umdah Fiqh, Al-Udda. And the Udda, the methodology he's following in writing the Udda is more of an Iraqi methodology, which is for each fiqh mas'ala, he puts mas'ala by mas'ala, right? And not right now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, inshallah, he'll make it easy for me, but I'm in the process of trying to number the masail in the Udda, because his masail, he goes mas'ala by mas'ala. And it's so detailed the way he does it. And what he does is he extracts that and then gives you the usuli point, because Baha'u'ddin al-Maqdisi
SubhanAllah.
deals with the fiqh and the usul fiqh.
MashaAllah.
And that's why he's the most authoritative commentator on the Umdah, because of his proximity. He can ask Muwaffiq al-Qudama, what about this? What about this? What about that? And sometimes he'll say, وَقَالَ شَيْخُنَا, and our sheikh has, and we know that that sheikh is Muwaffiq al-Qudama,
Allahu Akbar.
right? That is his sheikh and fiqh for that book. Is you can't do better than having the author of the book explain various expressions, because there's certain expressions that Imam Wahid al-Qadama uses that are sort of Palestinian dialectical expressions. So when you're trying to understand other kutub, they'll fall back on Baha'u'ddin to understand. So, oh yes, it's this, right? So they can fall back on and understand certain expressions that he uses, right, that are outside of the norm of what we would call fusha.
SubhanAllah, it's really hard to describe, but these men, this whole family, they have been extremely blessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the whole endeavor that they're taking.
And remember, this should be something that makes us reflect as well, because they're the children of refugees.
SubhanAllah.
And so people should take heart in this. If someone comes from a family where they're economic migrants or they're political refugees, they should not think, oh, look, I'm outside of my country. It's finished for me. And what will I do? No, no, no. They should say, Alhamdulillah, inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me this test for a reason. And that they should think about all the other great refugees of history. And these are a perfect example of a family that they struggled with tuberculosis. They struggled with typhoid. When we look at the life and times of Abu Umar al-Maqdisi, every single one of his wives had illness and died, because that journey of going from, after a huge jihad, a huge battle that they had to do a tactical retreat, the process of going through that, and then the travel of getting from there on foot to Damascus. It was just, subhanAllah, it had a huge, just the health impacts, the difficulty they suffered.
No.
Then you have to remember, now that they're in Damascus, Syria its weather is slightly different to Palestine. So they're in a different environment. The food is different. The fruit is different. The veg is different. So some people might have gotten sick. They might have taken them time for their body to adjust. All these types of things happen. But in spite of that, these men are still dedicated to knowledge.
Remarkable.
And that's what they've done. So Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, he was known for his knowledge. Now, at one point, someone mentioned Abu Tahir ibn Ismail ibn Dhufar al-Nabulsi. He said, جاء رجل الحافظ يعني عبد الغني بن عبد الواحد المقدسي. One day a man came to Al-Hafiz Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, and he said, I swear under pain of talaq of my wife that you have memorized 100,000 ahadith. Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi said, لو قال أكثر لصدق. He says this is true, but if he said it's much more than that, it would have been more correct.
Remarkable.
Right. So he's making it clear that, listen, your marriage is safe. You don't have to worry about talaq. But if you said more than that, that would have been better, because I memorized more than that. Now, Ziauddin al-Maqdisi has said that I've witnessed Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi on more than one occasion in the Jamia at Damascus, the Jami Bani Umayyah, being asked by those present about a matter while on the minbar, where they're saying, read to us these ahadith, or what's the narrative of this hadith? And Al-Hafidh Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi recites back to them the ahadith with their chains of transmission by heart. He was also asked on occasion by Abu Sulaiman ibn al-Hafidh, who said, one day someone said to Al-Hafidh, why don't you read all the time to the people by heart and just close the book? He said, because I don't want to suffer from conceit or arrogance by doing so. So he was able to do this, but he didn't want to show conceit to the people and to show arrogance. Now, as he was now established in Damascus, Ziauddin al-Maqdisi and Ibn Rajab mentioned that people's envy started to grow when they saw that his fame started to grow and spread, in particular in Jami' Bani Umayyah. In the Jami' Bani Umayyah, some people started to take a notice to him because he's teaching people hadith, he's teaching people the science of hadith, and he's teaching both Arabs, non-Arabs, the wealthy, the poor, and he is extremely accessible. He's appointed to the minbar of the Hanbalis during this time, and he goes to that minbar and he starts to preach to the people. Well, the Al-Maqdisi says, at one point, I saw Al-Hafiz Salafi and Abu Musa, Al-Hafiz Abu Musa, and Al-Hafiz Abdul Ghani ibn Wahid Al-Maqdisi. And I said to the two Hafiz, which is the most knowledgeable out of them? As-Salafi, Abu Musa, or Abdul Ghani? Who is the most knowledgeable? And they said, well, let's go and ask Abu Nizar. So they went to Abu Nizar, Rabi'a ibn al-Hasan as-San'ani, the Yemeni Hafiz, to which he said, I've been with Al-Hafiz Abu Musa. And I can tell you this, Hafiz Abdul Ghani ibn Wahid Al-Maqdisi, he's memorized way more than him. وَأَحْفَظُ مِنْهُ. He is the greater Hafiz out of them because of his knowledge. So, and he was known, the other Hufaz were known for their hifz because they were at 400,000. They're known for their hifz. But Abdul Ghani ibn Wahid Al-Maqdisi, because of starting out early, he memorized the Quran. He started memorizing a hadith immediately and started working on that. He worked on his fiqh, right? And if you look at his commentary on the Hidayah, his commentary is more hadith-based in terms of bringing out the masail in the hadith. Why is this like this? Why this hadith? Why in this fashion? He's extracting and bringing out the hadith knowledge. And he had a tremendous, tremendous handle on the hadith. Now, he starts with one of his first missions in hadith, and this causes the envy to grow of some people, is he goes through the Sihah. He goes through the Sihah. And he isolates all the narrators into the Sihah. He isolates all the narrators. Then he puts them in alphabetical order. And then he gives where the narrators came from, how many ahadith each narrator gave. Then he puts them all under one book. This book is called Al-Kamal fi Asma' al-Rijal. This book, if you want to understand the narrators of the Sihah, is one of the most important books to read. This book systematizes the process of studying the Sihah. And that's why when later narrators say, or when later hadith scholars say, this hadith is collected by Imam al-Tabarani, but its narrators are the men of the Sihah. That's what they mean. It means the same. They don't need investigation. They're the same narrators. So it's sahih, or rijaluhum min al-thiqat. The narrators of this are from the thiqat. They're from the people that everyone is agreed upon, because these people have been isolated, examined, critiqued. We know their names. We know where they're from the Sahaba to after. We know everything about them. He's doing this at the same time that Imam Ibn Jawzi rahimahullah has started this process of, which we touched on earlier, of Rawahul Bukhari, Rawahul Muslim, because he wrote the book At-Tahqiq, and At-Tahqiq opened the door for hadith study in terms of for everyone else to study. And this is why at this point you start seeing hadith commentaries becoming more prodigious, because at this time it had atrophied slightly. So Abdul Ghani ibn Wahid Al-Maqdisi starts this process of using language such as muttafaqun alayh, agreed upon by al-Bukhari and Muslim. Rawahul Khamsa, as narrated by the five. And he starts making a distinction between the Ashab al-Sunan, the four Sunan. The four, so people start to they have to start to learn who are the four sunan, right? Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Majah, Nasa'i, right? Fi Sahihain, he starts using the word Sahihain, right? The Sahihain is al-Bukhari and Muslim, right? Muttafaqun alayh, or Rawahul Jama'ah, which is the sixth, right? Then Rawahul Tis'a has been narrated by the nine, because it includes the Musnad, the Muwatta, and Darimi within that. So what he does is he starts creating this terminology where you can use these code words to mean a whole lot. So that way, muttafaqun alayh, you don't have to rawahul Bukhari wa Muslim fi sahihayhima. No, you can save time and just say muttafaqun alayh. It's agreed upon by Bukhari and Muslim. Right? He starts to use this language to make it easier. Ashab sunan, right? Or rahu fi sunan. It's narrated in the sunan, so people know, okay, this is in. So now when you're going to do the tahqiq on the narrators, or you want to study it, you don't have to say, oh, let me go to Bukhari and Muslim. No. You know it's in Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, Majah, Nasa'i, but it's not in Bukhari and Muslim. You know where it is, you know where to locate it. Right? You understand how this is found. Because one of the things that happens when people quote a hadith, there are two things of reasons why there sometimes wind up being disputes about a hadith besides the narrator. It's the address of the hadith, the takhrij of the hadith.
Right.
So sometimes the sheikh, when he's writing down the takhrij of a hadith, he might be tired, or he might not be paying attention. Or maybe the person that he took it from made the mistake and says, this is in Bukhari, but it's actually not. The hadith is sahih, but it's actually not in Bukhari. It's in Abu Dawood. And that's the job of muhaqqiqeen, to hunt that down when that happens, because sometimes they'll say, this hadith is sahih, and it is in al-Bukhari. So then later people that quote that book or that text, they say, listen, he says this book is sahih, but it's not in al-Bukhari. I've checked, it's not in there. And if he hasn't given the isnad, you can't agree with the hukm on the hadith, because you don't know whether it's sahih, because you've established, listen, it's not in al-Bukhari, but he says it's sahih. And he's not lying, but we need to check to know, to make sure this hadith is accounted for. So now you have to try to think, because if you haven't memorized the hadith collections, you're okay, where is this hadith found? So now you go on this mission to try to find these hadith. Well, Abdul Ghani and Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi, he revolutionized the area by creating a system and a structure so you know where these hadith are found. And by doing this, he streamlines it. Now, the first place he streamlines it into is Umdat al-Ahkam. And he has two Umdat al-Ahkam, the Kubra and the Sughra. The Kubra has 514 ahadith. The Sughra is 1,050. Now, the Kubra becomes the mainstay of how you study ahadith of ahkam. So, when you're a student of knowledge, you study fiqh, where you have, this is the prong that you start from. The first thing is you learn, what do I need to do? So they show you what you need to do. This is how you do wudu, this is how you do this. And you're learning just the fahm of it, just the fiqh of it, that's it. This is what you must do. You may have questions and he'll explain. Now, if you go further in the student of knowledge category, now you're going to understand the adillah behind the actual things that you're doing. Whether there's ikhtilaf, the arguments behind it, all these other things. Then the thing that comes after that is what are known as ayat or ahadith al-ahkam. Now, the ayat ahadith al-ahkam is now comparing between the particular school, or comparing between the imams. Now, normally what you do when you're studying, unless you're doing al-fiqh al-muqaran, which is a separate category, if you're just doing ahadith al-ahkam, what tends to happen, especially if you do umdat al-ahkam, the kubra al-sughra or bulugh al-maram, what happens is you are going to quote the ahadith of your particular method and what the mu'tamid is. And then you'll quote the imams of the other method, like Imam Abu Hanifa says this, Imam Shafi'i says this. You're not looking to establish the mu'tamid of other methods. That's other kutub to do that. This is just looking at what if the imams themselves that are the collectors of the madhab, what did they say? Oh, they say this, this, and this. And then the particular teacher that's teaching you says, the mu'tamid is this. So whatever madhab that you belong to. So if you're in a class where you're all Hanabila, is listen, the mu'tamid is this. Now Abu Hanifa has said this, 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 and this. Imam Ahmed has said this. And he says, now, the mu'tamid, though, of the aqwal is this. Oh, okay, all right. So you're given just an understanding so you can understand how the different imams are examining the same text, how they're understanding it, how they're understanding the adillah, comparing between them. So it's teaching you how to do usul al-fiqh and ahkam al-ahadith, understanding the ahadith and ahkam, the reasoning, how you can reason through these things. Well, Abdul Ghani Al-Maqdisi, by doing this, it creates this schema that all hadith scholars come under. And they carry on like that. That stayed like that to where everyone was studying. There are more commentaries on that book by other madhabs than there are by the Hanafi. Wow. Because it just took off like fire. Ibn Taqi al-Eid's got a commentary on it. The Malikis have a commentary. The Hanafis have a commentary on it. But they realized, because obviously the way that the book is written, the adillah and texts in it are weighted towards one particular madhab. Because it's designed towards that. It's weighted towards that. So Ibn Hajar, seeing this, decides to put together Bulugh al-Maram. And Bulugh al-Maram, he dies 852 Hijri, rahimahullah. Bulugh al-Maram is the Shafi'i, it's the adjunct that goes along with it so that you can study it. Because what was happening is if you're a Shafi'i and studying Umdat al-Hakam, you're like, well, wait a minute, how come the ahadith about touching, nullify, why is he joining between this hadith and this ayah? How come he's not using these, or how come he's saying, listen, this is hadith is da'if, la yahtaju bih, and it can't be used for argument? Why is he like, as a Shafi'i studying those when you hold the position that, yeah, touching nullifies wudu, skin to skin contact, mutlaqan, absolutely. And then he's saying, yes, and it's only with desire. It's like, now you have to explain that. Now you have to go through all, you're starting off having to debate these topics, whereas the point is to start the students off to get established on knowledge and then open it to other discussions. So Ibn Hajar sees this and decides to put together Bulugh al-Maram, which is sort of the Shafi'i answer to the Umdat al-Ahkam, the Sughra and the Kubra. But other scholars are still using the Umdah to today, to the point that they even use al-Umdah fil fiqh, like the Mauritanians. A lot of them are using Umdat al-Ahkam, and also the Umdah fil fiqh by Muwaffiq ibn Qudamah. They use that to study Ahkam. And an actual urjuza, a poem has been done. It's 95 pages by Sheikh Adud, which is how to study Umdat al-Ahkam and Umdat al-Fiqh. So it's still used today. But the way that it was put together was to familiarize you with the ahkam regarding ahadith, their applications. So when I did that, we did that book, we did al-Muntaqa. So we did Umdat al-Ahkam twice, the Kubra and Sughra. Then we did al-Muntaqa by Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, and we did Bulugh al-Maram. And when you do that, you can see the slight you can see like the discrepancies between them, like the ahadith that they've chosen to use. So when you study Bulugh al-Maram, you can see the discrepancy between that and Umdat al-Ahkam. There's a discrepancy. Well, the discrepancy is what ahadith were chosen and what the ruling is on a given ahadith, so on and so forth, right? And so, but Abdul Ghani Wahid Al-Maqdisi, he's the trendsetter. He begins this process. And because that book becomes so popular, envy goes into the heart of some people.